Have you had this problem before? When you're cutting across plywood, because typically the veneer is so thin, what can happen is the fibres can get damaged like this. So this is a brand new blade. I've only just used this for the first time, and it's razor sharp. But if you have a look here, see the difference between the two? One cuts on the upward stroke, which is this, and this one cuts stroking downwards. So it will be, if it cuts upwards, it will look rough on the top and it will look perfect on the bottom. And if it cuts downwards, it's the same but on the opposite side. What I like to do is I like to use a metal cutting blade. So you've got really, really fine teeth on here. So because the style of this blade is for cutting metal, it takes a little bit longer, but on both sides it leaves a clean finish. So we can see on the top here that it's beautiful and crisp, and also it's the same on the bottom. So some people will say, oh, just put some tape on there. The tape will stop it from getting damaged. Let's have a go. So the tape does work, but you can still see there's some damage there. So if you want to prevent any damage to your plywood when you're cutting it across the grain, then use a metal cutting blade. When cutting mortises with a mortiser, one thing that you want to ensure is that you always cut as much material out as possible, which will prevent anything from slipping. So what can happen is, let's say I come down and make a cut now. If I just try and come across ever so slightly and think, right, okay, because there's less material to remove, there's less resistance, it will cut through better. But what you can find is, as it goes down, so that's not cutting very well, as it goes down, what can happen is, because there's a bit of resistance on one side but not much on the other, what can happen is it can deflect to the side. So if you're using a thinner chisel, for example, they can physically bend, and then once it's bent, it's hard to unbend. So one thing that I like to ensure that I do is when I'm cutting my mortises, I'll do the extremities first. So I'll come down on this side, and then what I can do then is proceed to cut the bulk of the material away after that. And then if we realign this back up, we do exactly the same again. So we come down, come across to our mark, and cut down, and then once again we come across and try and remove as much of the material as possible. And then what we can do is we can adjust it so we're cutting out the centre, so it's right in the middle there. And let's come across to this point, cut that out, same again to the extremity, just a touch across. Now doing this will ensure that your holes are nice and square, and also you don't cause any damage to your chisel. To start off with, you want to get yourself a piece of MDF or plywood or something that's just nice and flat and wide enough, and cut it so it's longer than the in-feed and out-feed of your planer. And then what we want to do is establish that we want something roughly like this for the angle. And what I've done is taken a small fillet like this, run it through the planer just to get it to the right thickness that I need. And then what I can do is just set it into the centre, and then that gives me a good indication of the sort of angle that we're working with. What I want to do is have it a minimal about 12 inches or so. It will keep it at that angle as it's running through the machine, so it doesn't need to be the full length. You can just get away with putting it in the centre like this. Okay, and then we just take another scrap of wood. This is just another offcut, and then we cut it to the same size. And this was just a freehand cut, a wild guess, and it actually works quite nicely. So then what we want to do is just set our wood on top of this, and then we butt this up to here. So we'll start off by just gluing this fillet. So we can just use CA glue and activator just to speed things up a little bit. So we've put a clamp at the front and the back. And there we have it. Here's 5 useful tips when it comes to maintaining your bandsaw and making sure that it runs optimally. Okay, so first things first, if you've got a fence that runs on here, we want to make sure that that fence is parallel with the blade. So one thing we can do to test that is simply put a magnet on the side of the blade, but just make sure it's set back so it's not touching the teeth, and then get yourself a steel rule. And what that's going to do is that's going to give you the perfect line, so that makes sure that your fence is parallel with your blade. Next, we want to make sure that the bearings on the top and the bottom side are adjusted in a way that they don't make contact with the blade when it's rotating, but it's very, very close. So if the blade does deflect slightly, the bearing will engage and it will make it run against it. So you want zero contact, but as close as you can possibly get. Next is the tension of the blade. So you want to make sure that the blade is rigid, but it deflects a little bit, but not a huge amount, so it would make contact with anything. So we want it to have, just apply some pressure and it should move about 3 or 4 millimeters, and that's ideal. Next, we want to make sure the gullet, which is the deepest part of the tooth just there, that is in the center of the wheel. Because the top of the wheel has got a slight curve in it. We want to make sure at the peak of that curve, that's where we put the tension on the blade. So as the blade rotates, we want to make sure that it's not dipping. Now, if it was too far forwards, the blade would be curving in slightly and the tension would be further back on the blade. So we want to make sure it's nice and tense in the center of the wheel, and then we can tighten it up. And last but not least, we want to make sure that everything is in as good a condition as possible. So the blade is free of rust, the bearings run nice and smoothly, so when the blade is removed and there's no tension on it, just spin the top and the bottom wheel, make sure they spin nicely. Check the condition of the rubber that's attached to the outside of your wheels, and also check the condition of the belt that drives the wheel from the motor. And then you should be running optimally. This is a burnishing tool. This one's made by Katsu. I'm not endorsing this brand at all, but just want to show you how beneficial this is if you're going to use wood that's been sat outside or reclaimed. So this, I'm doing some work in my garden, and this has a bunch of dirt, a bunch of sand and grit in the surface. Now, if I run this through my saw, what's going to happen is the teeth are going to hit all the stones and going to cause damage to it. So all of the tiny bits, tiny particles of dirt and sand are going to cause damage to my tool, so this helps to prepare it. I'll show you how it works. So you can see here, it's really thick with mud and grit. So now that surface is all clean and completely free, and it's transferred onto my hand. So I can run this through my saw without risking causing damage to my blade.